Okay, welcome everybody. We want to welcome you to today's Martin Luther King Celebration Day at Adams State University. I'm Rich Leesbrock. I'm the chair of History, Anthropology, Philosophy, Political Science, and Spanish, and we've sponsored this today. And we are very fortunate to have as a speaker my predecessor as the chair of the department here, which is Dr. Ed Crowther, who taught many years, taught 30 years here at Adams State, and just retired last year. Ed had a couple of quick things. One is that I've had this question from I had a couple of new faculty ask me the other day and said, I've never been at a place where we don't recognize Martin Luther King Day by taking the day off. And I think that since Martin Luther King put such an emphasis on knowledge and understanding and education, it seems like learning and continuing to press that education is the best way to celebrate Martin Luther King Day here. But we're fortunate to have Dr. Crowther. And Dr. Crowther has worked extensively in this area. His own background is in really kind of the Civil War, the South, religion and American history, and then of course civil rights. He's taught a graduate course for us for many years on the civil rights movement. He's presented a similar form of this. He's also been instrumental in getting some great speakers to Adams State University on Martin Luther King Day as well. But with no further ado, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Crowther here. Thank you very much.
I'm blown away really to have opportunities like this, and I so appreciate people turning out for what I hope is a useful presentation and discussion about Dr. King in the age of Trump. And I didn't do that really to be provocative. I'll tell you a story, and I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. A week ago, I didn't know that I was going to do this talk. It seems they forgot. And so the first thing is, well, what's your talk going to be about? And I thought, well, don't show fear, don't show uncertainty. Make something up and then go with it. And so that's kind of what I did. And so that's what we're stuck with. But I think, you know, we live in the time that we live in. It's 2020. Dr. King was crucified, to use James Lawson's term, on the 4th of April, 1968. That's almost 52 years ago. So I'm not going to ask people who sort of have this hair color, or maybe no hair, to raise their hands. How many of you are under 52 years old? That's what I thought. Okay. And that's because a lot has happened since Dr. King was assassinated outside room 306 of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And so what I realized 10 or so years ago, a lot of what I need to do or have the opportunity to do is to bring King to you in sort of an accessible way, but also in the way that academics, those who study the life and career of Dr. King, as an aspect of the history of morality, as an aspect of the history of faith, as United States history in terms of race, the kinds of questions and answers and debates they have about the meaning of Dr. King. And so I will tell you this, and I almost didn't go there, but I am. In 2018, I delivered a paper. Now you have to wait for the whole thing, because depending on your politics, as soon as I start, you're going to form an opinion, and it won't be the opinion that I want you to form. It's an opinion that I struggle with coming to, but I gave a paper on the campus of Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's a great beer town, by the way, I'm just saying. And it was called Thank God for Donald Trump. And I had people coming up to me and dressed in a certain kind of hat going, I can't believe, what a wonderful thing. And I had people that I knew from my old days at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they're like, I can't believe that you've gone over. And I said, maybe you want to come and hear what I have to say about why I would say thank God for Donald Trump. And I think growing up in the American South, I grew up in a world full of pretense. You know, where we say an ounce of pretense is worth a pound of manure. We are so polite as to be so fundamentally dishonest that it's no wonder that we never get anything done. And so the piece about thank God for Donald Trump was simply to say, well, we can stop kidding ourselves about some things. We can finally begin to understand that part of the message of Dr. King was this idea that the work is endless, You see, stealing from the abolitionist Theodore Parker, which he does like a lot of scholars do. When somebody else says something great, you borrow it. The moral arc of the universe is long. Think about how long since that moment of consilience. 13.74 billion years. And we're still moving toward Andromeda. Long. But, and this is the redemptive part, it bends toward justice. So I think one of the things in recent years is realizing that important things happened between, say, 1954 and 1968, and they produced change. But they did not produce perfection in that classic sense of completeness. They did not produce reconciliation. They produced a glimpse, but not the realization of what we're going to learn today is called the beloved community. And so, in some ways, what an awesome thing. We can stop being polite and kidding ourselves and maybe learn, inspired by Dr. King and others, to do some pretty hard work. And it's hard work that makes us, it should make us uncomfortable. Dr. King once gave a talk where he said, you know, we need an agency. He called it a bureau, but he meant an organization of creative discomfort. If we're so polite and we pretend that everything is okay, when things are really not as okay as they could be, we're never going to get anywhere. Bad photo in the light, but this is the late Dr. Vincent Harding. He was a Mennonite. And if you don't think black people can be Mennonites, I'll ask you to think about assumptions that you might have about people. Anybody can be a Mennonite. So in that pietistic tradition, right, that informs so many people from the Reformation to this morning, Vincent Harding, who worked with Dr. King, and he has a Ph.D. in history from the University of Chicago, he says, look, let's stop using Dr. King to make us feel good. Let's use Dr. King to make us be good. That's a distinction with a giant difference. Just a hypothesis. And I love this. I love this last line. I think about this a lot. I have been on the 16th Street Mall in Denver where they have the pianos. And when the weather is bad, sometimes they lock the pianos and you'll see musicians on top of the piano perfecting their fingering technique. You can learn to play on a locked piano. You know, what a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so, as you'll see later, one of the books you ought to read is by Vincent Harding. Now this is the part where we do the stuff that, as a historian, you foolishly think, A, that everybody already knows this, and then even more foolishly think that people care. I've learned in this room that maybe don't care. Dr. King was born in January 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, part of the black elite in the African-American part of town, Auburn Avenue. Auburn Avenue and Peachtree intersect, and it was the heart of the African community. And he was the son of the most prominent minister in Atlanta, Georgia, Daddy King. And you know, this is a funny thing, learn a little bit about black people. Martin Luther King was not born Martin Luther King Jr. He was born Michael Lewis King. And when his father went to the Universität Heidelberg, right, just about the time Hitler's coming to power, by the way, he was so impressed with Martin Luther, he came back, changed his own name, and changed the name of his son. Yes, black people could go to elite German universities to get graduate training in theology. I'm a student of, the best thing I wrote about King was on his progress from undergraduate days to becoming a preacher. He wanted to be a doctor. And it was a man named George Dennis Sale Kelsey, a sociology professor, who got his Ph.D. at Yale. George Dennis Sale Kelsey at Morehouse College, he said, you know, Dr. King, it's really okay to be a preacher. They're not a bunch of morons after all. You can be an educated, intellectually honest preacher. You know what he did? He acted on his professor's advice. But studying the career of Dr. King in particular, I'm fascinated by the years, the sort of year and a half that he's at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, now Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. First, he didn't want to go to Alabama. He was offered a job in Detroit. His dad wanted him to come to Atlanta. Talk about the contingency that he winds up in Montgomery at all. He doesn't know what the future is going to hold. He prepared to be a leader, a Ph.D. qualified preacher of an urban elite black congregation. That's what he was preparing to do. And he did all the social gospel things, organized committees for, he encouraged people to register to vote and join the NAACP. And in essence, that's how the Montgomery bus boycott came about, was phone trees organized by church women. It's a fascinating story. On Sunday, at the end of November, he preached a wonderful sermon that we're going to get to from Luke chapter 10, when a person trying to pin down the Son of Man said, "Who is my neighbor?" Never ask the Son of Man a question unless you want the answer. It's a bad idea. And he told a story about a man who fell among thieves, and the priest and the Levite walked by, and it was the Samaritan who stopped to help. Who is my neighbor? Wrong question. You be neighbor. That's the answer. And that, in some sense, that's the core of the beloved community. But the next week after that sermon, Mrs. Parks, field secretary, or the secretary for the local chapter of the Montgomery NAACP, refused to honor the floating seat ordinance in Montgomery regarding city buses, and she was arrested. The women organized a boycott. When the men found out this could work, boycotted the city buses. They took it over and they created an organization, and because King was only 26 years old and had not been in Montgomery long enough to make enemies, he got the job of heading something called the Montgomery Improvement Association. Sometimes, when life gives you an opportunity, you find out what you actually bring to the table. Nobody saw King coming, and having read his own thoughts, he didn't see him coming either. And so he has this short public career, and that's what I want to emphasize. Short public career, not quite 13 years. And it was one of those careers that provoked change in a lot of directions. Let that sit with a lot of directions. The idea that there's a linearity to human history is a convenient fiction. Just one of those things. You know, the bus boycott was successful to create an organizational structure to push toward legal and social equality, originally in the Jim Crow South, but really across the United States. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, created in 1957, largely a ministerial alliance, to do the work of organizing African Americans through the ecclesiastical structures of the Baptist churches, members of the National Baptist Convention, and of course the African Methodist Episcopal and African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches. And across the South, sit-ins and marches, movements for voting rights, for economic rights. And of course the white power structure said, man, we're glad that black people have finally showed us what we need to do, and we're happy to, except that didn't happen. And you know this. So Easter, 1963, in the liturgical calendar, hugely important day. Dr. King spent Easter in jail. But if you've actually bothered to read the New Testament, you know that people who do good often wind up in jail. That's where we put those people. And so Dr. King writes one of the most important texts, letter from Birmingham City Jail, where he, in essence, says, you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Oh my word, what powerful words. His most famous address, and I'm going to do something I said I'd never do, we're going to deal with that text. I've avoided it because I think that as inspirational as the so-called I Have a Dream speech is, it has been the single most destructive speech King ever gave in the pursuit of human rights and human justice. Because one line that took him 3 seconds to utter in a 15-minute speech came to stand for the whole speech. And that's not a really good thing. But King's work, originally in the South and later in places like Chicago, would result in King, an African-American, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Important elements later in his career. The Selma to Montgomery March that was turned back brutally by Al Mingo and the state of Alabama Department of Public Safety. Talk about Orwellian language, right? I guess it depends on what you mean by public and by safety, right? But this would lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King went north, moved into what we would call crudely but descriptively slum housing, lived in Chicago trying to organize in Chicago a movement for nonviolent social change in Richard Daley's Chicago. And of course, as we learned in 1968, he was a man of peace. Well, if that meant cracking skulls of peaceniks, he was definitely a man of peace. But this is the point where King's rhetoric, which he had always said this, but it becomes part of the public consciousness, that what's wrong with the United States is what creates poverty at home and aggressive wars of imperialism abroad. He called it an acquisitive materialism. You see, the acquisitive materialism perverts you. Remember, King is a preacher. He's a supernaturalist preacher, right? So he would say it perverts you from what you were created to be into this base thing that you choose to become. Because you want to turn other human beings from humans into objects. That's why in Memphis, the striking sanitation workers carried a sign that said, "I'm a man." Because brown educated Henry Loeb, the mayor of Memphis, believed that black men were things. How do we know this? When 2 black men were crushed, escaping a rainstorm, 2 sanitation workers crushed by the compactor in their garbage truck and killed, their death benefit didn't cover the price of their funeral. And Henry Loeb just thought, well, they could just get better jobs, couldn't they? It's always easy when you're white to explain how non-white people should do things. And so Dr. King would ultimately champion the strike conducted by the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, Local Number 1733 in Memphis. And of course it was there that he would meet his end. A Remington Game Master Model 760 30-06 rifle whose slug travels at a velocity of 2,750 feet per second. Struck Dr. King right here with a slightly downward angle, and then straight down to the spine where it deflected upward, and just above his left pectoral muscle, almost exited but did not exit the skin. The blood spatter looked like a cross as he fell backwards onto the pavement. And that's why James Lawson referred to the martyrdom of King as a crucifixion. See, crucifixion, cruci-cross, that's where that term came from. Congress, moved by, the events, did pass the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that made racial restrictions in housing unenforceable under federal law. So, kind of a cool thing. So here's Dr. King winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And this is the stuff If you're a history student, this is the kind of stuff we talk about. So King he lived, he organized, he died, so what? Well, there's some things that came in his way. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed racial discrimination in public facilities that are engaged in interstate commerce, something that many members of the United States Senate want to get rid of. You might want to contact Senator Paul about that one. The Voting Rights Act, 1965. If I were teaching today, the whole course would be on the Voting Rights Act, not because it's the most important thing I can think of, but because it's something we can think about so that we understand that cause and effect is complex. You see, on the one hand, the Voting Rights Act did so much to enfranchise African Americans and permit African Americans to hold office that it inspired something else. It made the other side mad, right? And so they organized. And white Southerners became the core of the Republican Party. And white Southerners worked to ensure elections of presidents who would appoint members to a Supreme Court who would gut the Voting Rights Act. And in 2013, that's what they got. I joked, tell you about this book, The Long Southern Strategy, by two brilliant political scientists, Angie Maxwell and Todd Shields. I used to joke that I'd lived long enough to watch the entire United States become one big Mississippi. Now, to those of you that don't get Mississippi, that's not a good thing. These guys proved it. Proved it with voting data and polling data and painful. But what I like about this, at least we can be honest. Tell the truth. You really don't like it when other people have what you have, particularly when you convince yourself that it comes at your expense. Huge idea today. We've done this at Adams State, right? Dr. Centeno, right? Marched around the campus and said, immigration built this nation. Do I look illegal? And what a cool thing. That tactic to bring attention to, we just had the Women's March Saturday, right? To bring attention to matters of pressing social concern. That's something that harkens back to the movement. Here's the thing that I don't think gets enough credit. What was it all for? The part of King that is not specifically about supporting black people achieving a better life in the United States was all about helping all people become better. And that's what he meant by the beloved community, and it's everywhere in the writings of King, except the I Have a Dream speech. Doesn't appear. And what I did is I selected things across time, right? And the idea of nonviolent resistance is to achieve the beloved community, because violence corrupts, violence perverts. Violence is an irremovable stain from a person, right? Why do we vote? Not to win elections, but to use collective power to create the beloved community. My favorite word in the English language as I have gotten older, reconciliation. Oh my gosh. It's the most powerful idea that I know of, when that which is apart from something else comes together. What a powerful idea, right? And so this is the cool thing. The idea that reconciliation is in your own self-interest. That you can't be who you're supposed to be until everybody else is who they are capable of being, right? And ultimately, perfect sacrificial altruism is fundamentally, at its core, the best form of selfishness. Isn't that awesome? I kind of like it. The Jericho Road. This occurs a lot. King used this story. You know it maybe as the story of the Good Samaritan a lot. It was a favorite text, and he would adjust it for the moment. It was his last sermon before Mrs. Parks sat down. Actually, she simply refused to stand up, if you want to know the truth. It was the last sermon he gave in Memphis before he was killed the next day. The "Been to the Mountaintop" is the coda to this story, right? Who is my neighbor? Bad question. You be neighbor. And look at what the Levite says. How is this, or what the Samaritan says? If I don't stop to lend assistance to another, what will happen to them? Too often it's like, oh, I'm busy. I can't stop. I'll be late. That's a perversion of your opportunity to create something that's good for you because it's good for everybody, the beloved community. So how close are we? Don't know. I did this deliberately. I want you to think about who you are and own it. There are people who will say, well, of course, this means we might as well have slavery. You know, things are bad. Maybe. And there are enough people, even at a talk like this, it's like, why are you going there? What's this, more whitey bashing? My point is, your attitude about the existence of a slide in a public talk predicts, I think accurately, many things about you, who you are as a person. And let's just own it. Let's just say there are people that say, look, I'm so sick and tired of hearing about, you know, how bad the coloreds have it. That's the term we used when I was a kid. How bad, you know, they should just go back where they came from. At least be honest and own it. I got that from my grandmother, by the way. It's just one of those things. And so the point is that I would assert that whatever this tells us, it provides one measurement of how far we might be from what we might become as human beings. Just want you to think about that. Why? Why? Now I'm going to go all historian on you because, sadly, that's what I do. I mean, one of the reasons that the dream is elusive is a lot of people don't want the dream, but the question is why. And I think that one of it, just raising questions about the United States, whether this was in the context of the Cold War in the 1960s or in 2019 when the United States either is or is not on the brink of war, it bothers people. Because after all, the United States is better than other countries. I don't care what they say. Or in the parlance I learned to grow up, or that I grew up with, if you love Russia so much, why don't you move there? Yep. And it's like, yeah. But also, dealing with something like racism requires us to accept the power of the social construct of race. It suggests that people act in collective ways. But I'm an American. We're all individuals here. All of us together are individuals. Pretty hard thing to challenge. How many of you followed this one? So, I love this, and you know, if you're busy, I get this. But in August of 2019, the United States observed the 400th anniversary of the introduction of what were called 20 Negars in the official record into colonial Jamestown in Virginia. And so the New York Times served as the house for this effort to sort of commemorate 400 years of race and racial oppression in the United States. It didn't surprise me that there was a backlash. I'm used to that. I came of age in Ross Barnett's Mississippi. I know a lot about backlash. But for a historian, it posits a really important interpretive question that helps us understand a little bit, in part, of where we are now. Is the original sin of the United States, emerging out of British North America with chattel slavery as a fundamental institution, is that in the marrow of the identity of the United States, or is it merely a blemish, right? You see the difference? Because when you have bone marrow cancer, you got problems. You can pop a zip. Okay, just put this in crude terms so you can understand. And so it's a big dang deal, right? And this notion of U.S. exceptionalism has absolutely veiled the history of the United States and in most of its public declarations. I do this in every King talk because I always find so much in this statement. We got the King holiday in 1983. Utah, the last state to observe the King holiday, started observing in the year 2000. So congratulations, if you're 20 or younger, you've always had a King holiday everywhere. But I want to point out two things in this statement. So, you know, Reagan is a politician. He enjoys a lot of public support, and he says something that's got to be all things to all people. But he also, in the process of being all things to all people, reveals certain things about where he's coming from. This is U.S. exceptionalism. You know, racism was a blemish, and we Americans, what makes us exceptional is when we realize there's a problem, we fix it, right? And of course, the problem of race has been fixed, right? Yeah, absolutely. But that's American exceptionalism. And I hear a lot from people, look, they got the Voting Rights Act. We've had a black president. What more do they want? So I hear that all the time. But here's the part that I want to draw your attention to. When King talks about how the beloved community is good for you, the maintenance of something that is not the beloved community is bad for you. It blinds you. If King hadn't been in America, he wouldn't have gotten a chance to speak out. Okay? I'll go with that. This is where I get to go all myself on you. Not quite 2 months after the Montgomery bus boycott, King's house was bombed by people that looked like me, nearly killing Coretta Scott King and Yolanda King. Martin really did have a come to Jesus meeting. If you've read my essay on the 3 conversions of Martin Luther King, that night he finally found some transcendent something because he realized by speaking out he was going to die. He said early on, I don't think I'll live to be 40 years old. He died at 39 because he spoke out. But you can say, well, Crowther, those are your people, the cracker tards. This is what they do. Yes, that's true. 1964, Coretta Scott King opened a big envelope. It contained this letter and a lot of photographs, and it said this. You can look this up. Boy, King, I'm not going to call you lowlife.